For years he stood quietly behind Prince Harry, witnessing private moments the public would never see. But now, after years of silence, a former aide has stepped forward with a revelation so unexpected that even royal insiders were left stunned. What he claims happened behind palace doors may explain everything that followed, and according to those closest to the story, Meghan never knew this secret existed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. He was not the loudest voice in the palace, nor the most famous name attached to Harry's royal life, but that is exactly why his words now carry such a heavy shadow. For years, this aide moved through the private machinery of the monarchy, close enough to see the pressure building, but careful enough to never become part of the story himself. He watched Harry during moments of frustration, silence, anger, and retreat. He saw the young prince praised in public while privately wrestling with a sense of distance that never fully disappeared. And according to the aide's version of events, there was one incident inside the palace that quietly changed the direction of Harry's life long before the world understood what was happening. At the time, very few people noticed. Some staff believed it was simply another tense royal conversation. Others dismissed Harry's mood as temporary, but those who worked near him began to sense a shift. He became more guarded, more suspicious, more convinced that certain decisions were being made around him, not with him. The old warmth was still there, but it was surrounded by something sharper, something wounded. Palace insiders later whispered that this was the period when Harry stopped trusting the quiet promises of the institution. He began listening less to advisors who had guided him for years, and more to the doubts already forming inside him. The former aide stayed silent because loyalty inside the royal household is not just a rule. It is a kind of oath. You do not speak because silence protects the crown. You do not reveal because revelation can destroy lives. But silence also has a cost. And as speculation grew, as old decisions were questioned and fresh accusations reshaped public memory, this aide allegedly realized that one missing truth had been left outside the story. It was not about revenge. It was not about selling secrets. It was about explaining why Harry seemed to change before the world believed he had a reason to change. That is what makes the revelation so dangerous. Because if the aide is right, then the collapse that followed did not begin with one interview, one argument, or one royal exit. It began much earlier, in a private moment almost everyone ignored. But the aide's revelation wasn't about a single moment. It traced back to a hidden chapter of Harry's life that few people ever knew existed. Long before Meghan entered Harry's world, there were private conversations, confidential concerns, and deeply personal struggles unfolding behind palace walls. According to the aide, this forgotten period would eventually become the key to understanding everything that came later. Harry, at that time, was still seen by many as the charming spare, the soldier prince, the royal who could walk into a room and disarm tension with a joke. But behind that familiar image, the former aide suggests there was a quieter, heavier truth. Harry was carrying years of frustration that few people around him fully understood. He had grown up inside a system that gave him privilege, protection, and purpose, but also reminded him again and again that his place was always second, always conditional, always shaped by decisions made above him. Publicly, he smiled. Privately, according to those who watched closely, he questioned where he truly belonged. The burden did not arrive in one dramatic blow. It built slowly. A missed conversation here, a cold response there, a royal duty that seemed meaningful one day and meaningless the next. The aide reportedly saw Harry becoming more restless whenever discussions turned to his future role. There were whispers that senior figures wanted him useful, loyal, and visible, but not too powerful, needed, but not central, loved, but not fully trusted with the future of the institution. That contradiction cut deeper than most people realized. Harry could be celebrated by crowds and still feel like a guest inside his own family story. And that feeling, once planted, began to grow. Then came a confidential discussion involving senior royals, a conversation that the aide claims left Harry deeply unsettled. It was not shouted across a room or turned into a public scandal. It was quieter than that, which made it more dangerous. In palace life, the most important wounds are often delivered in calm voices. Reports suggest the discussion touched on Harry's long-term place within the monarchy, his responsibilities, his limits, and the unspoken boundaries he would never be allowed to cross. To outsiders, it may have sounded practical. To Harry, according to the Aide, it felt like a verdict. A future had been described to him, but not offered to him. He was being managed, not understood. From that point, the Aide noticed something different. Harry began to pull inward. He still performed the role, still carried the public warmth, still stepped forward when the crown needed him. But beneath it all, there was a new caution. He listened differently. He trusted less easily. He began to measure words, glances, and decisions as though they carried hidden meanings. The Aide did not know then how important this shift would become. Few did. But looking back, that period appears less like a passing mood and more like the first crack in a wall that had been standing for years. What seemed like a temporary struggle soon evolved into something far more significant, especially after one unexpected meeting changed Harry's path forever. According to the former Aide, one private meeting became the dividing line between the Harry everyone knew and the Harry who emerged afterward. The details remained buried for years, but the consequences quietly echoed through every major decision that followed. It was not presented as a crisis at first. In the polished language of palace life, it was treated as a necessary conversation, one of those controlled discussions where duty, future planning, and family expectation are wrapped together so tightly that no one can easily separate concern from command. But to Harry, according to the Aide, the meeting felt heavier than anyone in the room seemed willing to admit. Senior figures were said to be involved, along with advisors who understood the old rules of the institution better than they understood the private ache of the man sitting before them. Every word carried weight. Every pause suggested something already decided. The Aide later described the atmosphere as tense in the quietest possible way. There was no open explosion, no dramatic confrontation that could be easily retold as a single scandalous scene. Instead, the damage came through restraint. Harry was reportedly made aware of where the palace believed his path should lead, what lines could not be crossed, and how carefully his public role would need to be managed as the monarchy moved toward its next chapter. To the institution, this may have sounded like order. To Harry, it allegedly sounded like a warning. He was being reminded of his place, but not comforted in it. He was being offered responsibility, but not real control. And that difference cut through him like a hidden blade. The emotional impact, according to the former Aide, was immediate. Harry left that meeting changed, not broken in a way the public could see, but altered in a way staff could sense. His warmth became more guarded. His laughter came with distance behind it. The easy trust he once placed in certain advisors seemed to thin almost overnight. He began asking sharper questions. Who had approved this? Who had been told first? Who was really deciding the future? These were not the questions of a man simply annoyed by protocol. They were the questions of someone beginning to believe that the palace was not protecting him, but positioning him. In the days that followed, the Aide reportedly noticed Harry making small choices that carried larger meaning. He became more selective about what he shared. He withdrew from some familiar voices and leaned into his own instincts with a harder edge. What once looked like restlessness now seemed like preparation. The palace may have believed the meeting had contained a problem, but in truth it may have awakened something far more dangerous. A prince who no longer felt fully bound by the quiet agreements that had once shaped his life. And from that moment forward, every decision began to carry the shadow of that room. Yet the most shocking part wasn't the meeting itself. It was the secret understanding Harry carried away from it. The Aide claims Harry carried a deeply personal truth that he rarely discussed, even with people closest to him. It wasn't hidden out of malice, it was hidden because revealing it could have changed countless relationships before they ever had the chance to form. According to this version of events, the secret was not a document, not a title, and not some public scandal waiting to explode. It was an understanding Harry allegedly carried inside himself. that his future within the monarchy had already been quietly limited long before he was ready to accept it. He was useful, beloved, and needed, but only within a narrow space drawn by others. And once he believed that, every royal conversation began to feel different. The emotional weight of that belief was enormous. Harry had spent his life inside a family where duty was presented as love, and silence was often mistaken for strength. But if the Aide is correct, after that private meeting, Harry began to see silence as something else entirely. He saw it as control. He saw careful palace wording as a shield against uncomfortable truth. He saw polite reassurance as a way to keep him calm while the future moved, without him. That is why he rarely spoke openly about what he felt. To say it out loud would have forced everyone around him to choose a side. It could have turned private disappointment into open conflict. It could have made old family wounds impossible to hide. So he buried it. He carried it into engagements, family gatherings, planning discussions, and late-night conversations with people who thought they understood him. But insiders reportedly sensed something unresolved beneath the surface. There were moments when Harry seemed present but distant, agreeable but unconvinced. He could still perform warmth, but he no longer appeared fully at peace with the role being handed to him. Some staff believed he was simply restless. Others thought he was struggling with the pressure of public life. The Aide, however, allegedly understood that something deeper had shifted. Harry was no longer only asking what the crown wanted from him. He was asking what the crown had already decided he could never become. That made the Aide one of the few people close enough to recognize the pattern. He had heard enough, seen enough, and watched enough private reactions to understand why Harry's later choices carried such force. Still, even he did not know who else had been told the full truth. Did senior royals understand the depth of Harry's hurt? Did advisors underestimate what had been planted inside him? Did those closest to him see the warning signs? Or did they mistake pain for defiance? Those questions would later become impossible to ignore. Because a secret kept to preserve peace can sometimes become the very thing that destroys it. As Harry's life moved in a new direction, that hidden truth remained locked away, setting the stage for an unexpected collision of worlds. When Meghan entered Harry's life, everything appeared to move at remarkable speed. But according to the former Aide, there was one crucial piece of the puzzle missing from the beginning. A missing piece that would later make certain events look very different. Harry seemed energized, almost reborn, as if someone had finally stepped into the guarded space he had been protecting for years, and told him that his instincts were not madness, but proof that he had been misunderstood. For a prince who had spent so long feeling managed by the machinery around him, that kind of validation was powerful. It did not simply feel like romance. It felt to him like rescue. The relationship grew quickly, and with it came a change that palace staff could not ignore. Harry became more certain, more forceful, and less willing to accept the slow, careful rhythm of royal life. Longtime advisors, who had once been able to calm him or guide him through delicate moments, reportedly found themselves pushed farther from the center of his confidence. Where they once had access, there was now distance. Where they once offered advice, there was now suspicion. According to the former Aide, this was not only because Meghan had arrived. It was because Harry entered that relationship already carrying a private belief that the palace had quietly limited him. Meghan did not create that wound, the Aide suggests, but she stepped into the story before knowing how deep it ran. That is what made the early period so fragile. On the outside, the romance looked like a bright new chapter. Inside the royal household, however, some observers reportedly sensed a dangerous speed. Harry was making emotional decisions with the force of someone who believed time had already been stolen from him. He wanted protection, he wanted freedom. He wanted the woman he loved to be accepted without delay, without hesitation, without the cold testing ground that had shaped every other royal outsider. But the palace does not move on emotion. It moves on precedent, caution, and control. And the harder the institution slowed down, the more Harry seemed to read that caution as confirmation of everything he feared. Concerns were raised quietly, never in the open language of confrontation. But through careful warnings, private briefings, and tense conversations among staff who sensed the ground shifting, some worried Harry was becoming unreachable. Others believed he was simply defending his future. But the Aide allegedly saw the missing link. Meghan was entering a life shaped by a secret Harry had not fully shared. She could see his pain, but perhaps not its original source. She could hear his frustration, but not the private meeting that had sharpened it. And because that truth remained undisclosed, every disagreement risked becoming something larger than itself. A delay became disrespect. A question became rejection. A protocol became a threat. And as major royal milestones approached, the consequences of keeping that secret hidden became harder and harder to ignore. To the public, everything seemed clear. But behind palace walls, former staff members reportedly noticed tensions that didn't fit the official narrative. According to the Aide, certain disagreements may have had roots far deeper than anyone realized at the time. What looked like arguments over timing, protocol, privacy, and public pressure may have actually been shaped by the hidden belief Harry had been carrying for years. Every delay felt personal. Every correction felt like control. Every cautious palace response seemed to confirm the fear that had followed him from that private meeting. That his future was being managed by people who would never fully trust him with his own life. Staff members who had served through major royal moments reportedly began to notice a troubling pattern. Conversations that once could have been settled quietly became harder to resolve. Advice was no longer received as guidance, but as interference. A small concern raised by an advisor could turn into a deeper question about loyalty. A discussion about public duties could become tangled with old wounds about rank, respect, and belonging. The former Aide believed this was where the palace misunderstood the scale of the problem. They were trying to fix surface tensions while missing the private injury underneath. And that injury was now affecting decisions at every level. Communication behind the scenes reportedly began to break down in subtle but damaging ways. Harry seemed less open with people who had once helped him navigate royal pressure. Longtime advisors found themselves outside conversations they would normally have guided. Staff members were unsure whether they were dealing with a prince under stress, a husband trying to protect his new life, or a man reacting to years of quiet resentment. In truth, according to the Aide, it may have been all three at once. That is why the atmosphere became so unstable. No single issue could explain it. No single person could contain it. The hidden secret had become a lens through which Harry viewed almost everything. Misunderstandings multiplied. A carefully worded palace message could be read as cold. A delayed approval could feel like punishment. A private warning could sound like another attempt to box him in. Those closest to the household reportedly grew worried that Harry was drifting beyond the reach of old loyalties. The more they tried to steady the situation, the more he seemed to feel cornered. It was a brutal contradiction. The institution believed it was protecting order, while Harry believed that order had cost him his voice. And because the original secret remained unspoken, everyone was arguing around the wound instead of naming it. By then, concern among longtime palace staff had become impossible to ignore. Some feared the distance was temporary. Others sensed something permanent beginning to form. The Aide allegedly watched this change with a growing dread, knowing that the truth Harry carried could not stay buried forever. Yet, the most startling revelation was still waiting to emerge, and it would completely reshape how insiders viewed the entire story. Years after stepping away from royal service, the former Aide finally decided to tell his side of the story. What he revealed wasn't scandal for the sake of scandal, it was an attempt to explain a chain of events that many believe has been misunderstood from the very beginning. For a long time, he had stayed loyal to the old code of palace silence, the code that teaches staff to absorb pressure, bury memories, and protect the institution even when the truth begins to burn inside them. But as the years passed, and Harry's story became harder, louder, and more divided in the public mind, the Aide reportedly felt that one missing piece had been left in the dark for too long. His revelation was not presented as a simple attack on Harry, nor as a defense of the palace. That is what made it so unsettling. It sat somewhere in the middle, in that dangerous space where sympathy and warning meet. According to the Aide, Harry's later decisions could not be understood only through the lens of anger, marriage, media pressure, or royal duty. There was something older beneath it all. The belief that his role had already been quietly narrowed, that his voice inside the institution had been softened before it was ever fully heard. To many royal observers, that claim landed like a thunderclap. It did not erase what followed, but it complicated everything. Suddenly, past events began to look different. Moments that once seemed impulsive now appeared connected to a deeper fear. Arguments over privacy, rank, security, titles, and respect were no longer just separate storms. They began to resemble symptoms of a wound that had never healed. Commentators who had spent years debating Harry's choices were now forced to ask a harder question. Was he reacting only to present pressure, or to an old verdict he believed had been handed down long before Meghan became part of the story? That question gave the Aide's words their power. It turned the narrative from a simple royal fallout into something more tragic, more personal, and more dangerous. The reaction inside royal circles was reportedly uneasy. Some dismissed the Aide's account as too late, too convenient, too shaped by hindsight. Others believed it explained the pattern too well to ignore. Why had Harry pulled away from longtime advisors so sharply? Why did palace caution seem to wound him so deeply? Why did every disagreement appear to carry the force of something much larger? The Aide's revelation did not answer everything, but it opened a locked door. And once that door was open, the old story could not be neatly closed again. As interest grew among royal watchers and commentators, the revelation became less about blame and more about meaning. It forced a new reading of Harry's journey, not as a sudden break, but as a slow unraveling that began in silence. But understanding the revelation was only part of the story. The bigger question was what it ultimately meant for Harry today. Some secrets fade into history. Others quietly shape lives for years before finally coming to light. According to those familiar with the situation, this may be one of those rare revelations that forces people to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The former Aide's claims do not provide a clean ending, and perhaps that is why they feel so powerful. They do not turn Harry into a simple victim, nor do they erase the damage caused by years of public conflict. Instead, they suggest something more painful, that a hidden belief, carried quietly for years, may have shaped choices, relationships, and battles long before the world knew where to look. That is the long shadow of an unspoken truth. It does not remain still. It follows a person into love, into family, into duty, into arguments that seem to be about one thing but are really about another. For Harry, if the Aide's account is accurate, the secret was not just what happened inside one private meeting. It was what that meeting convinced him to believe about his place. Once a person begins to feel managed instead of valued, protected instead of trusted, included instead of truly heard, every future decision carries the weight of that wound. And inside a royal family built on silence, that kind of wound can echo for years. The revelation also changes how the public may view the entire story. What once looked like a sudden rupture now appears more like a slow fracture. What seemed like rebellion may also have been fear. What appeared to be defiance may have carried the pain of someone convinced he had already been pushed to the edge of the family map. But the mystery remains. Who truly understood what Harry was carrying? Who saw the warning signs and chose to ignore them? Who believed time would soften the problem, only to watch it grow sharper? Those unanswered questions are what keep the story alive. For the royal family, the emotional cost is impossible to measure. Trust was damaged. Loyalties were tested. Old wounds were reopened in front of the world. And for Harry, the cost may be even more personal. The burden of wondering whether his choices freed him from a system that hurt him or pulled him even farther from the people who once knew him best. That is the tragedy at the heart of this revelation. It does not offer victory. It offers a mirror, and in that mirror, every side sees something uncomfortable. So the Aide's words remain suspended over the story like a final warning. In royal life, silence can protect the crown, but it can also bury pain until it becomes impossible to control. And while the full truth may never be known outside palace walls, one thing is certain: the story that seemed finished may have only just begun. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.